In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a brutal murder shatters a genteel gathering, and only Hercule Poirot, with his unmatched intellect, can unravel the web of lies. A hidden note, a lost pearl, a burned cufflink, and a scandalous letter point to secrets of blackmail and betrayal. As suspects weave tales of debts and vengeance, Poirot's little gray cells uncover a killer hiding in plain sight. Will the truth emerge before another life is lost? Dive into a classic mystery where every clue counts and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Blackthorn Manor. The late September sun cast long, golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling Jacobean estate nestled in the heart of the Devon countryside. Its ivy-clad walls and towering chimneys loomed over the surrounding woods, exuding an air of grandeur tinged with melancholy, as though the house itself bore the weight of secrets long buried. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and the promise of an early autumn chill. It was the kind of setting that invited both serenity and suspicion, a place where politeness masked deeper currents of unease. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, gazed out of the window of their hired motor car as it crunched along the gravel drive. The invitation to Blackthorn Manor had come unexpectedly, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Eleanor Blackthorn herself. She had requested Poirot's presence for a weekend gathering, citing a matter of some delicacy that required his singular expertise. Hastings, ever eager for a change of pace from the bustle of London, had been delighted to accompany his friend, though Poirot's silence during the journey suggested he was already turning the matter over in his mind. "Mon ami," Poirot said at last, his voice precise and measured, "what do you make of this invitation? A grand house, a vague request, and no hint of the trouble that awaits. It is, I think, most curious." Hastings turned from the window, his broad face creasing with a smile. "Oh, come now, Poirot. It's probably nothing more than a family squabble over an inheritance or some such thing. Lady Blackthorn's a widow, isn't she? Perhaps one of her relatives is causing a fuss." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of mild disapproval. "You assume too much,"
their eyes seeming to follow the visitors with silent judgment. Lady Eleanor Blackthorn awaited them in the drawing-room, a space of faded opulence where heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows and a fire crackled in the grate. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with sharp blue eyes and a bearing that suggested both grace and steel. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was swept into an elegant chignon, and her navy dress was tailored to perfection. She rose to greet them, her smile warm but tinged with strain. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice low and cultured. "I cannot thank you enough for coming. I fear this weekend may prove trying." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes never leaving her face. "Madame, your letter intrigued me. You spoke of a delicate matter, but you did not elaborate. Perhaps you will do me the honor of explaining now." Lady Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening briefly on the arm of her chair. "In due time, Monsieur Poirot. First, allow me to introduce you to my guests. They are assembling for tea, and I believe it will be illuminating for you to meet them." Hastings noted the slight tremor in her voice, a crack in her otherwise composed facade. He exchanged a glance with Poirot, who merely raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. The drawing-room soon filled with the other guests, each arriving with the studied politeness of those accustomed to high society. First came Sir Reginald Blackthorn, Lady Eleanor's brother-in-law, a portly man with a florid complexion and a booming laugh that seemed to fill the room. He was a retired barrister, fond of his brandy and quick to regale anyone with tales of his courtroom triumphs. His wife, Clara, was a contrast in every way, slender, quiet and watchful, her pale eyes darting about as though cataloguing every detail. Next was Miss Violet Harrow, Lady Eleanor's niece, a vivacious young woman of 22, with auburn curls and a penchant for dramatic gestures. She wore a fashionable green dress that clashed slightly with the room's muted tones, and her laughter rang out frequently, though Hastings thought it sounded forced. Accompanying her was her fiancé, Dr. Julian Warwick, a handsome man in his early 30s with a calm demeanor and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when nervous. The final guests were Mr. As she lifted her teacup. Clara Blackthorne's gaze lingered too long on her husband, and Desmond Lyle's sharp retorts carried an edge that bordered on hostility. Poirot, for his part, was a study in quiet observation. He sipped his tisane, having politely declined the tea, and watched the room with the intensity of a hawk. Hastings knew that look. It was the look of a man whose little grey cells were already at work, sifting through the nuances of voice, gesture, and expression. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said at last, his tone deceptively mild. "This gathering, it is not merely a social occasion, n'est-ce pas? There is a purpose behind it." The room fell silent. Lady Eleanor's smile faltered, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of speaking. But before she could respond, the door burst open and Grayson appeared, his face pale. "My lady," he said, his voice shaking, "it's Mr. Lyle. He's dead." A gasp rippled through the room. Margaret Lyle let out a strangled cry, her teacup clattering to the floor. Violet clutched Dr. Warwick's arm, and Sir Reginald's face turned an alarming shade of red. Clara Blackthorne remained still, her expression unreadable. Poirot set down his tisane with deliberate care. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. "In the library, sir," Grayson replied. "I found him just now. He's been stabbed." Hastings felt a chill run through him. He glanced at Poirot, whose eyes gleamed with a sudden intensity. "Eh bien," Poirot murmured, rising to his feet. "It seems, mon ami, that our weekend has taken a most intriguing turn. Let us go to the library." As they followed Grayson through the dimly lit corridors, Hastings' mind raced. A murder at Blackthorne Manor, with all its guests present and accounted for, was precisely the kind of puzzle Poirot relished. Yet even as they approached the library, Hastings could not shake the feeling that this was no ordinary crime. The shadows of Blackthorne Manor seemed to whisper of secrets, and he knew that Poirot would not rest until every one of them was brought to light. The library door stood ajar, revealing a scene of quiet horror. Desmond Lyle lay slumped over a mahogany desk, a letter opener buried in his chest twitched. "Mon cher Hastings, nothing is straightforward where murder is concerned. This is a crime of calculation, but also of passion, and that, I think, is where we shall find our answers." As the other guests gathered at the door, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion, Poirot turned to Lady Eleanor. "Madame, I will need to speak with everyone present, and I will need a list of who was where and when, in the hour before Mr. Lyle was found. The little grey cells, they demand precision." Lady Eleanor nodded, her face pale but composed. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, whatever you need." Hastings watched as Poirot's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail, every face, every shadow. The game, as Poirot often called it, had begun, and in the quiet elegance of Blackthorne Manor, a killer was hiding in plain sight. The scene of the crime. The library of Blackthorne Manor was a room of imposing stillness, its heavy oak shelves and polished floors bathed in the soft glow of a single chandelier. The air carried the musty scent of old books, mingling now with the metallic tang of blood. Desmond Lyle's body remained slumped over the desk, the letter opener protruding from his chest like an accusation frozen in time. The scene was at once grotesque and strangely orderly, as though the killer had taken care to leave little trace of their presence. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of it all, his small, neat figure a stark contrast to the chaos of the crime. Captain Hastings hovered near the door, his stomach turning at the sight of the corpse. He had seen death before, in the trenches and in Poirot's many investigations, but the intimacy of this murder, the quiet brutality of it, unsettled him. The other guests clustered in the doorway, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Lady Eleanor Blackthorne stood apart, her hands clasped tightly before her, while Margaret Lyle, the victim's wife, leaned heavily against Dr. Julian Warwick, her sobs muffled but piercing.
Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved methodically over the room. He stepped lightly, as if reluctant to disturb the scene's delicate balance. "Hastings," he said, his voice low but clear. "Observe."
But it was calculated in its execution. He knelt beside the desk, his gloved fingers hovering over the blood-stained blotting paper. A single sheet of notepaper lay beneath Lyle's hand, blank save for a few smudged ink marks. Poirot tilted his head, studying the paper with the intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. "Curious," he murmured. "The ink is fresh, yet the paper is blank. What was Monsieur Lyle writing, I wonder? Or was he interrupted before he could begin?" Grayson, the butler, stood rigidly near the door, his gaunt face betraying no emotion. "Shall I fetch the police, sir?" he asked, addressing Lady Eleanor. "Yes, Grayson," she replied, her voice steady despite the pallor of her cheeks. "And please ensure no one leaves the manor until they arrive." Poirot raised a hand. "One moment, s'il vous plaît. Before the police trample through this scene, I would like to make a few observations. Madame," he turned to Lady Eleanor, "you will permit me to examine the room and the body before it is disturbed." She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, whatever you need." Poirot resumed his inspection, moving with the precision of a watchmaker. He noted the overturned chair, its legs slightly askew as though kicked aside in a struggle. The window was closed, its latch secure, ruling out an intruder from the gardens. A small silver cigarette case lay on the floor near the desk, its lid open, revealing a single cigarette. Poirot picked it up with a handkerchief, turning it over in his hands. "This belongs to whom?" he asked, his voice carrying to the group at the door. Margaret Lyle's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face crumpling. "It's Desmond's," she whispered. He always carried it, said it was a gift from his father." Poirot nodded, placing the case carefully on the desk. "And yet it is on the floor, as though dropped in haste. Most interesting." Hastings watched as Poirot's gaze swept the room once more, lingering on the bookshelves. A single volume, a worn copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles, was slightly out of alignment, its spine protruding as though hastily replaced. Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, moving instead to the fireplace, where a small pile of ash lay in the grate. He sifted through reputation. "But this is a police matter now. We'll take it from here." Poirot smiled, unruffled. "But of course, Inspector. I am merely an observer, offering my humble assistance. You will, however, permit me to ask a few questions of the household. It is my custom to understand the, how do you say, the lay of the land." Inspector Grayson grunted, clearly reluctant but unwilling to refuse outright. "Very well, but don't interfere with my men." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. He turned to the guests, who had retreated to the drawing-room under Grayson's watchful eye. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice commanding attention. "A tragedy has occurred, and it is my intention to discover its cause. I will speak with each of you in turn. For now, I ask that you remain here and refrain from discussing the matter among yourselves. The truth, it is delicate, and must not be disturbed." The group nodded, though their expressions ranged from fear to defiance. Sir Reginald Blackthorne mopped his brow with a handkerchief, muttering about the damned inconvenience of it all. Clara, his wife, sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point. Violet Harrow clung to Dr. Warwick, who patted her hand absently, his own face pale. Margaret Lyle had collapsed into a chair, her sobs quieter now but no less anguished. Poirot began with Lady Eleanor, drawing her aside to a corner of the room. "Madame," he said softly, "you invited me here for a reason. I suspect it was not merely for a pleasant weekend. Tell me, what is this matter of delicacy you mentioned in your letter?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered with something like fear, but she quickly masked it. "Monsieur Poirot, I had concerns about Desmond. He had been acting strangely, secretive, almost threatening. I feared he was planning something that might harm the family, but I never imagined—" Her voice broke, and she looked away. Poirot's expression remained impassive. And what was the nature of these threats? She hesitated. He spoke of old debts, of secrets he claimed to know about my late husband's business dealings. I thought he might be trying to blackmail me, but I had no proof. Madam Lyle, he said gently, my condolences for your loss. Can you tell me about your husband's state of mind this weekend? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. He was agitated. He wouldn't tell me why. He kept saying we needed to settle things before we left. I thought he meant business matters, but now... She trailed off, her hands twisting in her lap. And where were you when he left the drawing room? Poirot asked. I stayed with the others, she said. I was talking to Violet about her engagement. I never left the room. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. He continued his interviews, each guest providing their account of the tea-time hour. Sir Reginald claimed to have been discussing horses with Dr. Warwick. Clara said she had been reading a magazine, though she couldn't recall its title. Violet and Dr. Warwick corroborated Margaret's story, insisting they had all remained together. Yet Poirot's keen ears detected the slight hesitations, the overly emphatic denials, the glances that lingered too long. As the police began their work in the library, Poirot drew Hastings aside. Mon ami, he said, his voice low, this is a puzzle with many pieces, and not all of them fit as neatly as they appear. The cigarette case, the charred paper, the misaligned book, they are clues, yes, but they are also distractions. We must look beyond the obvious to the truth that hides in plain sight. Hastings frowned. You think someone's lying, don't you? Poirot smiled faintly. Not one, Hastings, several, and it is in their lies that we shall find our murderer. Chapter 3. The arrival of Poirot's method. The atmosphere in Blackthorn Manor had shifted irrevocably, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock of Desmond Lyle's murder. The drawing room, once a haven of polite conversation, now felt stifling, its occupants casting wary glances at one another under the weight of suspicion. The police, under Inspector Grayson's brusque command, had cordoned off the library, their heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors. Yet it was Hercule Poirot, with his quiet authority and unerring focus, who commanded the room's attention. Captain Hastings stood near the fireplace, watching his friend with a mixture of admiration. Died between 4 and 5 this afternoon. The letter opener pierced his heart. Death was likely instantaneous. No fingerprints, though. The killer was careful. Poirot inclined his head, his expression serene. Merci, Inspector. That is most useful. And the room itself, any signs of a struggle beyond the overturned chair? Grayson shook his head. None. The window was locked, the door unforced. Whoever did this was either let in by Lyle or was already in the room. We're taking statements now, but I'll warn you, these people are cagey. Nobody's saying more than they have to. Naturellement, Poirot murmured. It is the way of those who hide something. But fear not, Inspector. The truth, it reveals itself in the smallest details, the turn of a phrase, the flicker of an eye. I shall assist you, if you permit. Grayson grunted, clearly torn between professional pride and the reputation of the little Belgian detective. Do what you must, but don't get in my way. Poirot's smile was almost imperceptible. I assure you, Inspector, I am but a humble observer. As Grayson returned to his men, Poirot beckoned Hastings closer. Mon ami, he said softly, we must now establish the chronology of events. The police, they are concerned with fingerprints and footprints, but I, Hercule Poirot, am concerned with the human heart. Who was where, and why? That is the question. Hastings nodded, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. Right then. Lady Eleanor said everyone was in the drawing room for tea until Desmond left for the library, about 10 minutes before Grayson found him. That puts the time at roughly 10 minutes to 5, since Grayson came to us just after 5. Précisément, Poirot said. And yet we must verify this. Let us begin with the alibis, but also with the movements of our suspects. I wish to know not only where they claim to have been, but where they might have gone unnoticed. Poirot rose and addressed the group, his voice calm but commanding. Mesdames et messieurs, I apologize for the intrusion, but I must ask each of you to recount your movements between 4 and 5 o'clock this afternoon. The police will take your formal statements, but I, Poirot, wish to hear your stories now, in your own words.
We were discussing horses. Violet was there too, weren't you, darling?
Violet Harrow, her auburn curls slightly disheveled, managed a weak smile. Yes, I was with Julian and Margaret. We were chatting about the engagement party. I didn't go anywhere. Margaret Lyle, her face pale and drawn, spoke in a trembling voice. I was with Violet and Julian, as I told you. Desmond, he left to get something from the library. I thought it was just a letter or some papers. Clara Blackthorne, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice low and precise. I was in the drawing room as well, reading. I didn't notice anything unusual until Grayson came in. Poirot's gaze lingered on Clara, noting the way her hands remained perfectly still, her expression almost too composed. And you, Madame Blackthorne, saw nothing of Monsieur Lyle's departure? Clara met his eyes briefly before looking away. No, I was engrossed in my magazine. Lady Eleanor, standing by the window, added, I was hosting, of course. I remained with my guests the entire time. Poirot nodded, his fingers steepled before him. Merci. Your accounts are most helpful. And yet, I must ask, did anyone see Monsieur Lyle leave the drawing room, or notice anything unusual before Grayson's announcement? A heavy silence followed. Violet bit her lip, glancing at Dr. Warwick, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. Sir Reginald coughed, reaching for his brandy glass. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, and Clara's eyes flicked toward her husband. Lady Eleanor remained still, her face a mask of calm. It was Grayson, the butler, who broke the silence. If I may, sir, he said, addressing Poirot, I saw Mr. Lyle leave the drawing room at about 10 minutes to 5. He seemed agitated. He said he needed to fetch something from the library, as Mrs. Lyle mentioned. And you, Grayson, Poirot said, turning to the butler, where were you during this time? I was in the hall, sir, preparing to bring more tea. I saw Mr. Lyle pass by, but I didn't follow him. I was in the kitchen when I heard a noise, a thud, I thought, from the library. That's when I went to check and found him. Poirot, the Hound of the Baskervilles. He pulled it out, revealing a small, folded piece of paper tucked behind it. Hastings, he said, unfolding the paper with care. Observe this. A note, hidden where it might be overlooked. The paper was crumpled, its ink slightly faded. It read, Meet me at 4:45. Library. Urgent. The handwriting was hurried, unsigned. Hastings leaned closer. Good Lord, Poirot. A rendezvous? Could this be why Lyle went to the library? Perhaps, Poirot said, his tone thoughtful. But who wrote it, and why hide it? This note, it is a clue, but also a question. We must consider its purpose. He moved to the fireplace, sifting through the ashes once more. Another fragment caught his eye, this one bearing a single word, debt. Poirot's expression darkened. Debt, he murmured, a word that carries much weight. Lady Eleanor spoke of debts, did she not? And now we find this. Hastings frowned. You think Lyle was blackmailing someone? That's why he was killed? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Blackmail, mon ami, is a dangerous game. But we must not leap to conclusions. The note, the cigarette case, the ashes, they are pieces of the puzzle, but the picture is not yet clear. As they left the library, Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping the corridor. Hastings, he said, this manor is a stage, and our suspects are actors, but one of them has played a deadly role. We must watch closely, for the next act is about to begin. Back in the drawing room, the tension had thickened. The guests sat in uneasy silence,
their earlier politeness fraying at the edges. Poirot's mind was already at work, cataloguing every word, every gesture. The note, the ashes, the alibis, they were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and he would not rest until he had woven them together to reveal the truth. Chapter 4. The questions deepen. The clocks of Blackthorn Manor ticked on, their steady rhythm a stark contrast to the undercurrent of dread that now permeated the house. The drawing room, with its heavy drapes and flickering firelight, had become a stage for suspicion, each guest a player in a drama none could escape. Hercule friend's mind turning over every detail, seeking the pattern beneath the chaos. Poirot rose, his movements deliberate, and addressed the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "I have spoken with each of you briefly, but now we must delve deeper. A man is dead, and the truth lies not in what you say, but in what you conceal. I ask you to be candid, for the sake of justice." Sir Reginald Blackthorn, his face still flushed from brandy, let out a snort. "Candid? You're accusing us of lying, Poirot. I've told you where I was, right here, with Warwick, talking about horses. What more do you want?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint sign of amusement. "What I want, Sir Reginald, is precision. You say you were here, discussing the derby, yet you did not notice Monsieur Lyle leave the room. A man of your robust presence, he does not pass unnoticed, no?" Sir Reginald faltered, his bluster fading. "Well, I suppose I was caught up in the conversation. Didn't see him go." "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, turning to Dr. Julian Warwick. "And you, Doctor? You were also engrossed in this discussion of horses, yet you did not see your fiancé's uncle leave." Dr. Warwick adjusted his spectacles, his calm demeanor faltering slightly. "I was distracted, yes. Violet was talking about our engagement plans, and I was listening to her. I didn't notice Desmond." Violet Harrow, her auburn curls framing a face now pale with strain, nodded quickly. "That's right, Monsieur Poirot. Julian and I were chatting with Margaret. We didn't see Desmond leave either." Poirot's gaze shifted to Margaret Lyle, who sat hunched in her chair, her hands clutching a damp handkerchief. "Madame Lyle," he said gently, "your husband left the drawing room at approximately 10 minutes to 5. Did he say anything to you before he went? A word, a gesture, perhaps?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He said he needed to fetch some papers from the library. He was tense, almost angry. I asked if something was wrong, but he just shook his head and left." Poirot nodded, filing the information away. He turned to Clara Blackthorn, whose quiet presence had gone almost unnoticed. "Madame Leave, as I told you, but I thought nothing of it. He often went to the library to work." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci. And now, I must ask a delicate question. Madame Lyle, your husband's cigarette case was found on the floor near the desk. Was he in the habit of dropping it?" Margaret shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No. He was very particular about it. It was a family heirloom. He always kept it in his pocket." "Curious," Poirot said, his tone thoughtful. "And the note, meet me at 4:45, library, urgent. Does anyone recognize the handwriting?" He produced the crumpled paper, holding it up for all to see. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, but no one spoke. Violet's eyes widened, and Dr. Warwick's hand tightened on her arm. Sir Reginald coughed, reaching for his glass, while Clara's face remained a mask of calm. Lady Eleanor's gaze lingered on the note, her expression unreadable. "No one?" Poirot pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "Very well. Then let us consider another detail, the fragment of paper in the fireplace, bearing the word debt. Does this word mean anything to any of you?" The silence was heavier now, almost suffocating. Margaret's hands trembled, and she looked away. Sir Reginald's face darkened, and he muttered something under his breath. Dr. Warwick cleared his throat, but said nothing. Violet bit her lip, her eyes darting to Lady Eleanor, who remained still. Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. The silence, It speaks louder than words. But no matter. The truth, it will emerge. He turned to Hastings, lowering his voice. Mon ami, I wish to examine the library once more, but first, let us speak with Grayson, the butler. His account of the thud interests me greatly. They found Grayson in the hall, directing a maid to prepare rooms for the police, who would remain overnight. The butler's gaunt face was composed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as Poirot approached. Grayson, Poirot said, his tone courteous but firm. You heard a thud, you said, just after 5 o'clock. Can you describe it precisely? Grayson nodded. It was a dull sound, sir, like something heavy falling. Was as they had left it. The air still heavy with the scent of blood and old books. Poirot moved to the desk, his fingers brushing the edge where the cigarette case had been found. Hastings, he said, consider the sequence of events. Monsieur Lyle receives a note, asking him to meet someone in the library at 4:45. He goes, perhaps expecting a confrontation. The killer strikes, using the letter opener, a weapon of opportunity. The cigarette case falls, the chair is overturned, and a paper is burned in the fireplace. Yet the door is closed, the window locked. This is a crime of intimacy, mon ami. The killer was someone Lyle knew, someone he trusted enough to meet alone. Hastings frowned. But who? And why burn a paper? What were they hiding? Poirot's eyes gleamed. That, Hastings, is the question. The word debt suggests a motive, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. Lady Eleanor spoke of blackmail. Could Lyle have been pressing someone for money, or for silence? And the note, who wrote it, and why hide it behind a book? He moved to the bookshelf, examining the spot where the Hound of the Baskervilles had been misplaced. This book, he said, it is not an accident. Someone placed it here, perhaps in haste. We must discover why. As they left the library, Poirot paused in the corridor, his gaze sweeping the polished floor. Hastings, he said, there is another detail that troubles me. The thud Grayson heard. It was after 5, yet the coroner places the death between 4 and 5. If Lyle was killed earlier, what was the thud? And if later, why the discrepancy? Hastings shook his head, bewildered. You think Grayson's lying? Not lying, perhaps, Poirot said, but mistaken or misled. We must watch him closely, as we must watch them all. Back in the drawing room, the tension had only grown. The guests sat in uneasy silence, their earlier camaraderie replaced by suspicion. Poirot's questions had stirred the waters, and Hastings could sense the ripples spreading. Someone in this room knew more than they were saying, and Poirot would not rest until he had uncovered the truth. The red herrings emerge. The evening had settled over Blackthorn, had set his mind ablaze, and Hastings knew that the little Belgian was now weaving a net of logic to ensnare the truth. Yet the police, led by the gruff Inspector Grayson, were pursuing a different path, one that Poirot had quietly dismissed as the obvious road to nowhere. Inspector Grayson entered the drawing room, his face set in a scowl. "We've found something," he announced, holding up a small monogrammed handkerchief. The initials J.W. were embroidered in fine silk thread, stained faintly with what appeared to be blood. "This was tucked under the desk in the library. Care to explain, Dr. Warwick?" Dr. Julian Warwick, who had been murmuring to Violet Harrow, started visibly. His hand flew to his spectacles, adjusting them nervously. That's mine," he stammered, his face paling. "But I haven't been in the library since yesterday. I must have dropped it then." Violet clutched his arm, her eyes wide with alarm. "Julian, you didn't! Tell them you didn't!" Inspector Grayson's eyes narrowed. "You were seen arguing with Lyle yesterday afternoon, Doctor. Care to tell us what that was about?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Sir Reginald Blackthorne leaned forward, his florid face alight with interest. Clara, his wife, remained still, her gaze fixed on Warwick. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened on her chair, while Margaret Lisle let out a soft gasp. Warwick's voice was unsteady. It was nothing serious. Desmond and we had a disagreement about a business venture. He wanted me to invest in one of his schemes, but I refused. It was just a heated discussion, nothing more. Business venture, Grayson repeated, his tone skeptical. And now we find your handkerchief near a murdered man's body. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Poirot stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Pardon, Inspector, but may I see the handkerchief? Grayson hesitated, then handed it over. Poirot examined it carefully, his gloved fingers tracing the embroidery. The blood, it is faint, no? Not fresh, as one might expect from a recent crime. And the handkerchief is crumpled, as though it has been handled carelessly. Tell me, Doctor, when did you last use
To her husband's cigarette case, now in police custody. Sir Reginald muttered something about jumping to conclusions, while Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Poirot turned to the group, his tone calm but commanding. Mesdames et messieurs, let us consider the facts. Monsieur Lisle was killed between 4 and 5 o'clock, in a locked room with no signs of forced entry. A note summoned him to the library at 4:45. A cigarette case was dropped, a chair overturned, a paper burned, and now a handkerchief appears, conveniently marked with initials. These are not random events. They are the work of a mind that wishes to obscure the truth. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. I ask you again, does anyone know of this business venture Dr. Warwick mentioned, or of any reason Monsieur Lisle might have been summoned to the library? Margaret Lisle spoke, her voice trembling. Desmond was always involved in schemes. He had a way of pressuring people. I told him it would lead to trouble, but he wouldn't listen. Lady Eleanor's voice was sharp. Margaret, please, this is not the time. Poirot's gaze flicked to Lady Eleanor. Madame, you spoke of Monsieur Lisle's secretive behavior, of possible blackmail. Did this involve his business dealings? Lady Eleanor hesitated, her composure faltering. I don't know the details. Desmond was always vague about his ventures. He hinted at knowing things, about my late husband, about others. I thought he was bluffing. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. And you, Sir Reginald, as a barrister you must have known of Monsieur Lisle's financial dealings. Sir Reginald's face reddened. I kept out of his affairs. The man was a gambler, always chasing quick profits. If he got himself into trouble, that's his own doing. Clara's voice was soft but cutting. Reginald, you did lend him money last year. You said it was a favor, but you were furious when he didn't repay it. Sir Reginald spluttered, his brandy glass shaking. That's neither here nor there. A private matter, Clara, and I'll thank you not to air it in front of strangers. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A debt, then. Most interesting. And you, Madame Blackthorne, did you know of this loan? Clara's gaze met his, cool and still.
I wish to examine the library once more. But first, let us speak with Grayson again. His account of the thud is precise, but I wonder, was it the sound of murder or something else? They found the butler in the hall, polishing a silver tray with mechanical precision. His gaunt face was impassive, but his hands betrayed a slight tremble as Poirot approached. Grayson, Poirot said, you heard a thud at 5 minutes past 5. Can you be certain of the time? Grayson nodded. Yes, sir. I glanced at the hall clock as I passed it. It was exactly 5 minutes past. And the noise, did it come from the library, or could it have been elsewhere? Grayson hesitated. I assumed it was the library, sir, as that's where I found Mr. Lisle, but the sound was muffled. It could have come from nearby. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Nearby. Perhaps the study, or the conservatory. You did not investigate further? No, sir, Grayson said. I went straight to the library. Merci, Poirot said, dismissing the butler. He turned to Hastings, his voice low. The thud. It is a puzzle. If Lisle was killed before 5, as the coroner suggests, What was this sound? A diversion, perhaps? Or an accident? They returned to the library, now dimly lit by a single lamp. The police had left, leaving the room eerily quiet. Poirot moved to the desk, his fingers tracing the edge where the handkerchief had been found. "Hastings," he said, "observe the floor. There is a faint mark here, near the desk, a scuff, as though something was dragged." Hastings squinted, barely making out the mark in the dim light. "Could it be from the chair?" "No," Poirot said. "The chair's legs are rounded. This mark is sharp, like a heel. Someone moved quickly, perhaps in panic." He knelt, examining the floor more closely. Near the bookshelf, he found another clue, a single pearl, small and lustrous, half hidden under a rug. "Mon ami," he said, holding it up. "This is not a library ornament. It belongs to someone. But who?" Hastings shook his head. "Violet wears pearls, doesn't she? Or perhaps Lady Eleanor?" Poirot's smile was faint. "We shall see."
Perhaps thinking investigation. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood by his friend, his notebook filled with scribbled details, though he felt increasingly out of his depth in the face of Poirot's relentless precision. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his small, neat figure silhouetted against the flickering flames. In his hand, he held the single pearl he had found in the library, its luster catching the light like a tiny beacon. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved from the pearl to the faces of the guests, each of whom seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. The discovery of Dr. Warwick's handkerchief had stirred suspicion, but Poirot's instincts told him that the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the subtle, a gesture, a word, a contradiction that would unravel the web of deceit. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "we have made progress, but the puzzle is far from complete. A man is dead, and the clues we have found, the note, the cigarette case, the handkerchief, the pearl, point to a crime of calculation. Yet there is something more, something that eludes us. I ask you now to consider carefully. Has anyone seen this pearl before?" He held up the small orb, its surface gleaming. Violet Harrow's hand flew to her throat, where a strand of pearls hung, though none appeared to be missing. It looks like one of mine," she said, her voice faltering. "But my necklace is intact. I don't understand." Dr. Warwick, seated beside her, frowned. "Violet, you haven't been in the library, have you? You were with me the whole time." Violet nodded quickly, her auburn curls bouncing. "Of course, Julian. I was in the drawing room, as I said." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "Mademoiselle, you are certain. Pearls, they are not so easily lost. This one was found beneath a rug, near the bookshelf. It suggests someone was there, perhaps in haste." Violet's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "I don't know how it got there. It's not mine." Poirot turned to Lady Eleanor, who stood by the window, her face pale but composed. "Madam, you wear pearls as well, no? Might this belong to you?" Lady Eleanor touched her own necklace, a double strand of lustrous pearls. "Mine are all accounted for, Monsieur Poirot. I have—" Voice softened, but its edge was unmistakable. "The silence. It is eloquent. Someone wrote this note, and someone hid it. Why? To summon Monsieur Lyle to his death, perhaps? Or to mislead us after the fact?" Inspector Grayson, who had re-entered the room, snorted. "You're chasing shadows, Poirot. The handkerchief points to Warwick, and his argument with Lyle gives him motive. Why complicate things?" Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of mild exasperation. "Inspector, the obvious is rarely the truth. The handkerchief, it is too convenient. A killer who wipes away fingerprints but leaves a monogrammed clue? No, it is a distraction, a red herring to divert us from the real path." Grayson's scowl deepened, but he said nothing, gesturing for Poirot to continue. Poirot turned to Hastings, lowering his voice. "Mon ami, I wish to examine the library once more, but first, let us consider the timeline. The coroner places the death between 4 and 5, yet Grayson the butler heard a thud at 5 minutes past 5. This discrepancy, It is the key to unlocking the puzzle. They returned to the library, now eerily quiet in the absence of the police. The desk, the overturned chair, the bookshelves, all remained as they had been, though the air felt heavier, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Poirot moved to the bookshelf, his fingers brushing the spine of the Hound of the Baskervilles, where the note had been hidden. "Hastings," he said, "observe the book. It is slightly askew, yes, but not by accident. Someone placed it here, perhaps to conceal the note, or to draw attention to it." Hastings frowned. "You think the killer hid the note deliberately?" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps it was hidden by another, someone who saw more than they admit. We must consider all possibilities." He moved to the desk, his eyes falling on the blotting paper, still stained with Desmond Lyle's blood. The smudged ink marks caught his attention once more. He tilted his head, studying them closely. "Hastings, look here. The ink is uneven, as though something was pressed against it. A letter, perhaps, that was never sent." Using a small magnifying glass from his pocket, Poirot examined the paper. Faint impressions of reversed letters were visible.
Thoughtful. V, he said. For Violet, perhaps? Or another name? This, Hastings, is a clue in detail, a small thing, but significant. Hastings shook his head, bewildered. "You're seeing things I don't, Poirot. A pearl, a note, a letter V. How does it all fit?" Poirot's smile was faint but confident. "It fits, mon ami, because it must. The little grey cells, they see the pattern where others see only chaos. We have a crime of precision, but also of passion. The pearl, it belongs to someone. The note, it was written by someone. The letter V, it points to someone. And the debt, it binds them all." As they left the library, Poirot paused in the corridor, his gaze falling on a small side table. A vase of roses stood upon it, one petal missing, as though plucked in haste. "Another detail," he murmured. "A rose without a petal, a pearl without a string. These are not accidents, Hastings. They are signs." Back in the drawing room, the guests had grown restless. Sir Reginald was pacing, muttering about the infernal delay of the police. Clara sat silently, her eyes following her husband's movements. Violet and Dr. Warwick whispered together, their faces drawn. Margaret Lyle stared into the fire, her expression vacant. Lady Eleanor stood apart, her hands clasped tightly, as though holding herself together by sheer will. Poirot addressed the group once more. "Mesdames et messieurs, I have found another clue, a fragment of paper with the letter V. Does this mean anything to you?" Violet's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "V? That could mean anything. It's just a letter." "Indeed," Poirot said, his tone mild. "But in a murder, nothing is just anything. I ask you all to reflect on this. The truth, it is close, but it requires courage to face." As the guests dispersed to their rooms for the night, under police supervision, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Mon ami," he said, "the net is tightening. The pearl, the note, the letter V, they are threads in a tapestry of deceit. Tomorrow, we shall pull them taut, and the picture will begin to emerge." Hastings nodded, though his mind was a whirl of questions. Poirot's confidence was unshakable, but the clue the previous evening had left their mark, and the guests' faces bore the strain of sleepless hours and whispered fears. Hercule Poirot stood by the window, his small, immaculate figure a study in calm precision. His hands were clasped behind his back, his mustache perfectly symmetrical, but his eyes, those sharp, unyielding eyes, darted from one guest to another, cataloguing every gesture, every glance. Captain Hastings, seated near the fireplace, watched his friend with a mixture of awe and frustration. Poirot's discoveries, the pearl, the note, the letter V, the charred fragment, had deepened the mystery, and Hastings could sense that the little Belgian was closing in on a truth that remained maddeningly out of reach. Inspector Grayson entered the room, his expression grim. "We've interviewed the staff," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "No one saw anything unusual, and the alibis hold, for now, but I'm not convinced. Someone in this house knows more than they're letting on. Poirot inclined his head, his tone courteous but firm. Inspector, you are correct to sense deception. The truth, it hides in the shadows of what is not said. I have observed much, and I believe we are on the verge of uncovering something significant. Grayson's scowl softened slightly, though his skepticism remained. You've got a knack for theatrics, Poirot. If you've got something, spit it out. Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. Patience, Inspector. The truth, it reveals itself in its own time. For now, let us explore a new thread, the matter of debts and secrets. Madame Lyle, he turned to Margaret, who sat hunched in an armchair, her eyes red-rimmed. You said your husband was agitated, speaking of settling things. Can you tell us more? Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her handkerchief. Desmond, he was always chasing deals, always looking for the next opportunity. But lately, he was different, more secretive, more desperate. He mentioned a debt, something he said would change everything. I begged him to tell me, but he wouldn't. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A debt, madam. To whom? Margaret shook her head, tears spilling over. He wouldn't say. He just kept muttering about me.
He never paid a penny back.
You are furious, don't pretend otherwise. The room stirred, the guests exchanging glances. Violet Harrow's eyes widened, and Dr. Warwick's hand tightened on her arm. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure fraying. Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara. Madam, you seem well informed about your husband's financial dealings. Did you know of any other debts Monsieur Lyle might have had? Clara hesitated, her pale eyes flickering.
I overheard Desmond talking to someone a few weeks ago, here at the manor. He was angry, saying they owed him, not money but something else. He mentioned a promise and keeping silent. I didn't think much of it at the time.
Poirot's moustache twitched. A promise. Most interesting. And who was he speaking to, madame? Clara's hands folded tightly in her lap.
I couldn't see. They were in the conservatory and I was passing by. I only caught fragments.
Poirot nodded, his mind clearly racing. He turned to Lady Eleanor. Madam, you spoke of Monsieur Lyle's hints at blackmail. Could this promise be related? Lady Eleanor's face paled, but her voice remained steady.
I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. Desmond was always vague, always hinting at things he claimed to know about my husband's business. I thought he was trying to unsettle me, to gain some advantage.
Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did he succeed, madam? Did he unsettle you? Lady Eleanor met his gaze, her expression resolute.
No, I refused to be intimidated.
The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Poirot turned to Dr. Warwick, whose handkerchief had cast suspicion upon him. Doctor, you argued with Monsieur Lyle about a business venture. Was this related to a debt or a promise? Warwick adjusted his spectacles, his voice steady but strained. It was a business matter, as I said. Desmond wanted me to invest in a speculative venture, a mining project in South Africa. I refused. It wasn't about debts or promises, just bad business. Violet's voice was sharp, almost defensive.
Julian's telling the truth. Desmond was always pushing people into his schemes. He tried to get me to convince Julian, but I told him to leave us alone.
You think Violet's involved? She seems too flighty for murder.
Flighty, perhaps, Poirot said, but not without motive. We must watch her closely, and we must return to the library. There is something we have overlooked. They slipped away to the library, now guarded by a single constable, who nodded grudgingly at Poirot's request to enter. The room was as they had left it, the desk still bearing the faint stains of blood, the bookshelves looming in silent witness. Poirot moved to the fireplace, sifting through the ashes once more. His fingers paused on a tiny metallic object, a cufflink, engraved with the initial R. Hastings, he said, holding it up. Another clue in detail. This belongs to Sir Reginald, perhaps, or another R. It was buried in the ashes, as though someone tried to destroy it. Hastings leaned closer. Good Lord, Poirot. You think Sir Reginald was in the library? Perhaps, Poirot said. Or perhaps it was placed there, like the handkerchief. We must ask him. They returned to the drawing room, where the tension had only deepened. Poirot held up the cufflink, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Sir Reginald, is this yours? Sir Reginald's face reddened, his hand flying to his cuff. Yes, it's mine, but I lost it weeks ago. I haven't been in the library since then. Clara's eyes narrowed. You lost it, Reginald? Or did you leave it somewhere you shouldn't have? Sir Reginald spluttered, his bluster returning. What are you implying, Clara? I'm no murderer. Poirot's smile was faint but piercing. No one accuses Sir Reginald, but the cufflink, it was found in the fireplace, among the ashes. How did it come to be there? Sir Reginald shook his head, his voice rising. I don't know. Someone must have taken it, planted it to make me look guilty. The room erupted in murmurs, the guests' eyes darting between Sir Reginald and Poirot. Violet clutched Warwick's arm, Margaret stared blankly, and Lady Eleanor's hands tightened. Clara's expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered on her husband. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the room. Mesdames et messieurs, the clues multiply, but so do the lies. A debt, a promise, a cufflink, a pearl. Each
Revelations, the cufflink, the debts, the whispered promises, had left the guests on edge, their polite facades crumbling under the weight of suspicion. The drawing room, with its heavy velvet curtains and flickering firelight, seemed to trap the tension, amplifying every glance and murmur. Hercule Poirot, ever the calm observer, stood by the mantelpiece, his small figure radiating a quiet intensity that commanded the room. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, missed nothing, and Captain Hastings, seated nearby, could sense that his friend was on the cusp of a breakthrough. The police, under Inspector Grayson's brusque direction, had taken Sir Reginald Blackthorne for further questioning, his protests echoing down the corridor. The discovery of his cufflink in the library's fireplace had cast a shadow over him, though Poirot's cryptic remarks suggested he was not convinced of its significance. Hastings, scribbling in his notebook, felt the puzzle growing more complex with each new clue. The pearl, the note, the letter V, the cufflink, all pointing in different directions, yet somehow connected. Poirot turned to the remaining guests, his voice soft but penetrating. Mesdames et messieurs, we have uncovered much, but the heart of this mystery remains hidden. A man is dead, and the clues we have found, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, suggest a crime of both calculation and passion. I ask you now to consider, what drove someone to such an act? Was it fear, greed, or perhaps betrayal? The word hung in the air, stirring a ripple of unease. Violet Harrow, her auburn curls framing a face pale with strain, clutched Dr. Warwick's hand, her eyes darting nervously. Margaret Lisle, seated alone, stared into her lap, her handkerchief twisted into knots. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, her posture rigid, while Clara Blackthorne, usually so composed, seemed to falter, her hands trembling slightly. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice low and unsteady. Monsieur Poirot, I can't keep silent any longer. There's something you need to know. The room froze, every eye turning to her. Hastings leaned forward, his pen poised, sensing the weight of her words. Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Madame Blackthorne, he said, please.
Desmond said he had proof, letters, documents, that Charles was killed deliberately to cover up a financial fraud. A gasp rippled through the room. Violet's hand flew to her mouth, and Dr. Warwick's face paled. Margaret Lisle looked up, her eyes wide with shock. Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of intense interest. Madame, he said, his tone gentle but probing, this is a grave accusation. You say Monsieur Lisle had proof of a murder, disguised as an accident, and he used this to blackmail your husband? Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. He came to us last month, saying he'd found letters in Charles's old study, here at the manor. He said they implicated Reginald in a scheme to defraud investors, and that Charles's death was arranged to keep him quiet. Desmond demanded money, £10,000 to stay silent. Lady Eleanor's face was ashen, her hands clenched. Clara, you don't know what you're saying. Those letters were destroyed years ago. Desmond was lying. Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I saw them, Eleanor. Desmond showed me one, a letter from Charles to a solicitor, accusing Reginald of embezzlement. He said there were more, hidden somewhere in the manor. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And where are these letters now, madame? Clara hesitated, her voice breaking. I don't know. Desmond said he'd hidden them, but he wouldn't tell me where. I begged Reginald to pay him, to make it go away, but he refused. He said Desmond was bluffing, that he'd deal with it himself. The room was silent, the weight of Clara's confession settling like dust. Hastings scribbled furiously, his mind racing. A scandal, a murder, a blackmail scheme. It was the kind of motive Poirot had been searching for, yet it raised more questions than answers. Poirot turned to Margaret Lisle, whose grief seemed to have deepened with Clara's words. Madame Lisle, did your husband ever speak of these letters, or of Charles Blackthorne? Margaret shook her head, her voice trembling. No, but he was secretive, always hinting at things he knew. He said he had insurance, something that would protect us if things went wrong. I thought he meant money, but maybe it was those letters. Poirot nodded, his mind clearly working at lightning speed.
Cheeks, the way her eyes darted to Warwick. Mademoiselle, you seem certain of your fiancé's innocence. Yet the handkerchief, the argument, they cast a shadow, no? Violet's eyes filled with tears. It's not fair. Julian didn't do anything. You're twisting everything. Poirot raised a hand, his tone soothing but firm. Calm yourself, mademoiselle. I twist nothing. I seek only the truth. And the truth, it is close. He drew Hastings aside, his voice low. Mon ami, Clara's confession is the turning point we needed. A scandal, a murder, a blackmail scheme. These are the threads that bind our suspects. But the letters, where are they? And why was the note hidden, the cufflink burned? We must search further. They returned to the library, now a familiar battleground of clues and shadows. Poirot moved to the desk, his fingers brushing the blotting paper once more. Hastings, he said, the smudged ink, it troubles me. If Lisle was writing when he was killed, where is the letter? And if it was taken, why burn only fragments? He knelt by the fireplace, sifting through the ashes with renewed focus. A tiny scrap caught his eye, bearing the words, "To E." Poirot held it up, his expression grave. "To E," he murmured. "Eleanor, perhaps, or another." Hastings frowned. "You think Lady Eleanor was involved in the scandal?" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps she was a target. The letters, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, they are pieces of a puzzle, but the picture is not yet clear." They moved to the bookshelf, where Poirot examined the spot where the Hound of the Baskervilles had been misplaced. His fingers traced the shelf, pausing on a faint scratch mark, barely visible. "Hastings," he said, "this mark, it is fresh. Something was moved here, something heavy. A book, perhaps, or a box." Using a small knife, Poirot pried gently at the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single folded letter, its edges yellowed with age. Poirot unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. "Mon ami," he said, "this is one of Charles Blackthorne's letters. It accuses Reginald of revelation." The morning's confession from Clara Blackthorne had shattered the fragile veneer of civility among the guests, and now, as midday approached, the drawing room was a cauldron of suspicion and fear. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of those gathered, each one a study in guarded unease. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, immaculate figure radiating a quiet authority that belied the storm brewing around him. Captain Hastings, seated near the door, clutched his notebook, his pen poised to capture every word. The discovery of Charles Blackthorne's letter
hidden behind the bookshelf, had confirmed Clara's story of a scandal and possible murder, but it had also raised new questions. Why had Desmond Lyle hidden only one letter? Where were the others? And how did the pearl, the cufflink, and the note fit into the puzzle? Hastings could sense that Poirot was preparing to tighten the net, to apply the psychological pressure that would force the truth to the surface. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept the room, lingering on each guest in turn. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, her posture rigid, her face a mask of controlled composure. Margaret Lyle sat hunched, her hands twisting her handkerchief, her grief now tinged with fear. Violet Harrow clung to Dr. Julian Warwick, her auburn curls framing a face pale with anxiety. Clara Blackthorne, having unburdened herself of the family scandal, sat with her hands folded, her pale eyes darting nervously. Sir Reginald, released from police questioning but still under suspicion, paced near the fireplace, his florid face glistening with sweat. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and measured, "we stand at a crossroads in this investigation. A man is dead, and the clues we have uncovered, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, the letter, point to a crime rooted in secrets long buried. Madame Blackthorne has spoken of a scandal, of blackmail, of a murder disguised as an accident. Yet the truth remains elusive. I propose, therefore, to gather you all in the library this evening, where we shall confront these secrets together." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Violet's hand tightened on Warwick's arm, and Margaret let out a soft gasp. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, while
"This, we don't need your parlour games."
Poirot inclined his head, his tone courteous but firm.
"Inspector, your methods are admirable, but they are not enough. The killer has left clues, yes, but they have also left lies. It is in the confrontation of these lies that we shall find our answers. You are, of course, welcome to join us." Grayson's scowl deepened, but he nodded grudgingly. "I'll be there, but don't expect miracles." Poirot turned to Hastings, lowering his voice. "Mon ami, the trap is set. Tonight we shall gather them all in the library, where the crime was committed. The pressure, it will force a crack in the facade. Someone will falter, and that faltering will lead us to the truth." Hastings frowned, his mind racing. "You're sure about this, Poirot? What if they all stick to their stories?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "They will not, Hastings. The human heart, it cannot bear the weight of guilt forever. We shall apply the pressure, and the guilty one will betray themselves." The day passed in a haze of tension, the guests avoiding one another's eyes, their conversations stilted and strained. Poirot spent the afternoon in quiet observation, his notebook filling with meticulous notes on each suspect's behavior. He returned to the library several times, examining the desk, the bookshelf, and the fireplace with renewed focus. Hastings followed, marveling at his friend's relentless attention to detail. In one such visit, Poirot paused by the window, his fingers brushing the locked latch. "Hastings," he said, "observe the latch. It is secure, yes, but there is a faint scratch here, as though someone tested it. Not to enter, perhaps, but to ensure it could not be opened from outside." Hastings leaned closer, barely making out the mark. "You think the killer checked the window to make sure they wouldn't be seen?" "Précisément," Poirot said. "This was a crime of planning, but also of opportunity. The killer knew Lyle would be alone, and they ensured no one could interrupt." They moved to the desk, where Poirot examined the blotting paper once more. The smudged ink marks, faint but persistent, caught his eye. He tilted his head, his magnifying glass hovering over the surface. "Mon ami," he said, "the ink, it is not random. There is a pattern here, a word perhaps." Library. Their faces a mixture of dread and defiance. The room was lit by a single chandelier, casting long shadows across the bookshelves and the desk where Desmond Lyle had met his end. The police stood at the back, Inspector Grayson's arms crossed, his expression skeptical. Poirot stood before the desk, his hands clasped, his voice steady. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we are here to reconstruct the final moments of Monsieur Lyle's life. He came to this room at 4:45, summoned by a note. He sat at this desk, perhaps to write a letter, to Lady Eleanor, if the blotting paper is to be believed. And then he was struck with a letter opener from this very desk. The cigarette case fell, the chair was overturned, a paper was burned. But why? And by whom? He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. Let us begin with the note. Meet me at 4:45. Library. Urgent. Who wrote it? And why hide it behind a book? Violet's voice was sharp, almost desperate. You keep asking about the note, but none of us know. Why are you tormenting us? Poirot's gaze softened, but his tone was firm. Mademoiselle, I torment no one. I seek the truth. The note was hidden, perhaps to protect someone, or to mislead us. And the pearl, found near the bookshelf, does it belong to you? Violet's hand flew to her necklace, her face flushing. I told you my pearls are all here. Poirot nodded, turning to Sir Reginald. And the cufflink, Sir Reginald, found in the ashes. You say you lost it weeks ago, yet it was burned, as though to hide it. Why? Sir Reginald's face reddened. I don't know. Someone's framing me, I tell you. Clara's voice was quiet but cutting. Reginald, you were in the library yesterday. I saw you, arguing with Desmond. You didn't tell anyone. The room gasped, and Sir Reginald's bluster faltered. It was nothing. A private matter. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A private matter, Sir Reginald, like the loan you made to Monsieur Lyle, or the scandal of your brother's death. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. Enough, Monsieur Poirot. You're tearing us apart with these accusations. Desmond was a schemer, yes.
Desk where Desmond Lyle had met his end. His small, immaculate figure commanding the room with a quiet intensity that belied the gravity of the moment. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved from face to face, as though peeling back the layers of deceit that had cloaked the truth. Captain Hastings, standing near the door, felt his heart race. The clues, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, the letter, the smudged ink, had led to this moment, and he knew Poirot was about to unveil the solution to the puzzle. The guests sat or stood in a tense semicircle. Lady Eleanor, her composure strained. Margaret Lyle, her grief etched into every line of her face. Violet Harrow, clutching Dr. Warwick's arm. Clara Blackthorne, her pale eyes watchful, and Sir Reginald, his florid face glistening with sweat. Inspector Grayson loomed at the back, his arms crossed, his skepticism palpable. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice clear and deliberate. We have gathered here, in the very room where Monsieur Desmond Lyle was murdered, to uncover the truth. A man is dead, struck down by a letter opener. His life ended in a moment of calculation and passion. The clues, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, the letter, the ashes, have pointed us in many directions. But now, with the aid of the little grey cells, I shall reveal what really happened. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by Poirot's raised hand. Let us begin with the facts. Monsieur Lyle was killed between 4 and 5 o'clock, as the coroner has confirmed. He was summoned to this library by a note. Meet me at 4:45. Library. Urgent. The note was hidden behind a book, The Hound of the Baskervilles. A pearl was found near the bookshelf, a cufflink in the fireplace, a letter accusing Sir Reginald of fraud hidden in a secret compartment. And on the blotting paper, the faint impression of a letter addressed, To Eleanor. These are not random. They are the threads of a tapestry woven by a clever hand. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. First, let us consider the note. It was written to bring Monsieur Lyle here, to this room, at a precise time. But who wrote it? The handwriting, it is distinctive, with a flourish on the L that matches a sample I found in the ashes, bearing the initial R. You claim it was lost weeks ago, Sir Reginald, yet it was burned, as though to destroy evidence. Why? Sir Reginald's voice was hoarse. I told you, someone planted it. I wasn't here. Clara's voice cut through, sharp and cold. You were here, Reginald. I saw you leave the drawing room just before Desmond did. You followed him. The room erupted in gasps,
and Sir Reginald's face turned purple. "That's a lie, Clara. I went to the study, not the library." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the outburst. "Madame Blackthorne, your observation is noted, but let us turn to the letter, hidden in the bookshelf. It accuses you, Sir Reginald, of fraud and implicates you in your brother Charles's death. Madame Clara spoke of Desmond's blackmail, of his threats to expose this scandal. This gives you a motive, non?" Sir Reginald spluttered, but Poirot continued, his voice relentless. "And yet, there is another motive. Madame Lisle, your husband spoke of insurance, of settling things. Was he blackmailing others as well? Madame Eleanor, you hinted at his threats against your late husband's legacy. And Dr. Warwick, your argument with Lisle suggests he sought to entangle you in his schemes." Margaret Lisle's voice was barely audible. He said he had proof, something that would protect us. I didn't know what." Lady Eleanor's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Desmond was a liar, Monsieur Poirot. He had no proof, only bluffs." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Bluffs, perhaps, but deadly ones. Let us reconstruct the crime. Monsieur Lisle receives the note, written by Mademoiselle Harrow, or someone imitating her hand. He comes to the library at 4:45, expecting a meeting. He sits at the desk, perhaps to write a letter to Madame Eleanor, as the blotting paper suggests. The killer enters, perhaps through the door, which Grayson found closed but not locked. The letter opener is seized, and Lisle is struck, a single precise blow to the heart. The cigarette case falls, the chair is overturned, a paper is burned. But why? He paused, his gaze locking on Lady Eleanor. "Madam, the letter on the blotting paper was addressed to you. Why would Monsieur Lisle write to you at hoping to protect Reginald? But I didn't kill Desmond." Poirot's expression softened. "I believe you, madame. But you have helped me see the truth. The killer was not protecting a secret, they were destroying one." He turned to the group, his voice rising. "The killer is among us, and their motive was not money, but fear of exposure. The note was written by Mademoiselle Harrow, but not to summon Lisle. It was written by another, using her hand to mislead us. The pearl was dropped, perhaps by accident, perhaps deliberately. The cufflink was burned to cast suspicion on Sir Reginald. And the letter V, it was not for Violet, but for vengeance." He paused, his eyes locking on Dr. Warwick. "Doctor, you argued with Lisle, but it was not about a business venture. It was about Violet. Lisle knew something about you, something you could not allow to be revealed. You followed him to the library, using the note to lure him. You struck him with the letter opener, then staged the scene, the fallen cigarette case, the overturned chair, the burned paper. But you made a mistake. The pearl, it fell from your pocket, a gift you had bought for Violet, not yet given." Warwick's face drained of colour, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "That's preposterous. I was in the drawing room." Violet's voice was a scream. "Julian, tell them it's not true." But Poirot was relentless. "You were not, Doctor. You slipped out, unnoticed in the chatter of tea. Grayson heard a thud at 5:05, not the murder, but your attempt to burn the letters in the fireplace. You hid the note, hoping to implicate Violet, but you could not destroy all the evidence. The pearl betrayed you." Warwick rose, his hands shaking. "You have no proof. This is all conjecture." Poirot's smile was cold. "The proof, Doctor, is in your reaction, and in the letter I found, which mentions a medical scandal, a patient who died under your care, a secret Lisle uncovered. You killed him to keep it hidden." The room erupted in chaos, Violet sobbing, Margaret gasping, Sir Reginald shouting. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his skepticism replaced by grim determination. "Is this true, Warwick?" Warwick's shoulders slumped, his voice breaking. I had no choice." Though the truth, now unveiled, had lifted a weight from the room. Dr. Julian Warwick had been taken into custody by Inspector Grayson, his confession still echoing in the minds of those who remained. The guests, shaken and subdued, had retreated to their rooms or the drawing room, leaving Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings alone in the library, where the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Poirot stood by the desk, his small, immaculate figure a picture of calm reflection. His hands were clasped behind his back, his mustache perfectly symmetrical, but his eyes, those sharp, unyielding eyes, held a trace of weariness, as though the unraveling of human deceit had left its mark. Hastings, seated in a high-backed chair, closed his notebook with a sigh, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous evening. The solution, so clear in hindsight, had been a masterful display of Poirot's logic, yet it left Hastings with a lingering sense of unease. "Mon ami," Poirot said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but precise. "You are troubled, no? The case is solved, the murderer apprehended, yet you sit with the furrowed brow of a man who questions the world." Hastings managed a faint smile. "You've done it again, Poirot. You saw through the lies, the clues, the distractions, straight to the truth. But I can't help feeling, well, a bit sorry for them all. Violet, Margaret, even Sir Reginald, they're all caught up in this mess, aren't they? And Warwick, he seemed so decent, until he wasn't." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of quiet agreement. "The human heart, Hastings, it is a complex thing. It loves, it fears, it betrays. Dr. Warwick was a man of intelligence, of promise, yet he allowed fear to drive him to murder. It is a tragedy, yes, but one of his own making." Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "But how did you know, Poirot? The pearl, the cufflink, the note, they all pointed in different directions. How did you piece it together?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. "It is always a matter of order, mon ami. The clues, they are like the threads of a tapestry. Each one must be examined, but only in relation to the whole. Let us retrace the steps, for it is in understanding the method that we learn." Insisted it was not hers. This was a clue of opportunity, a small thing, dropped in a moment of panic. The cufflink, bearing the initial R, was burned in the fireplace, suggesting an attempt to destroy evidence. Yet Sir Reginald's protests of innocence rang true, his bluster, his fear, they were not those of a guilty man. Hastings nodded, his mind following Poirot's logic. And the letter, hidden in the secret compartment, it confirmed Clara's story about the scandal. "Précisément," Poirot said. The letter accusing Sir Reginald of fraud and implicating him in Charles Blackthorne's death was Desmond Lyle's weapon of blackmail. But it was incomplete, a fragment. Why hide only one? Because the others had been burned, their ashes scattered in the fireplace. The fragment with the letter V, not for Violet, but for vengeance, the motive that drove the killer. He turned to the fireplace, his voice softening. The thud, heard by Grayson at 5:05, was not the murder, for the coroner placed Lyle's death earlier. It was Dr. Warwick, burning the letters to destroy the evidence of his own secret, a medical scandal, a patient's death under his care, which Lyle had uncovered. Warwick lured Lyle to the library with the forged note, struck him with the letter opener, and staged the scene, the fallen cigarette case, the overturned chair, the smudged ink, to confuse us. Hastings frowned. But the ink on the blotting paper, to Eleanor, wasn't that a clue? Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. A clever misdirection, Hastings. Warwick wrote it after the murder, pressing the paper to create the impression of a letter Lyle never wrote. He wished to cast suspicion on Lady Eleanor, whose own secrets about her husband's business made her a plausible target. But the little grey cells, they saw through the ruse. Hastings shook his head, marvelling. "You make it sound so simple, Poirot, but I was lost in the tangle of clues." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The truth, mon ami, is always simple, once the distractions are removed. The killer's mistake was in believing they could outwit Hercule Poirot. They forgot that the human heart, it cannot hide its guilt forever. Warwick's fear, his protectiveness of Violet, his nervous gestures, they betrayed him. They stepped into the corridor. This case, it reminds us of the fragility of trust. Each of these people, Lady Eleanor, Margaret, Violet, Sir Reginald, Clara, they carried secrets, fears, hopes. Yet it was Warwick's fear that led to murder, a choice that destroyed not only Lyle, but himself." Hastings nodded, his voice soft.
It's a grim business, Poirot. Do you ever get tired of it? Unraveling these tragedies, seeing the worst in people. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful, his voice tinged with melancholy. Tired, mon ami? Perhaps. But it is my purpose, to bring order where there is chaos, to shine the light of reason on the darkness of crime. The little grey cells, they do not rest until justice is served. And yet, I confess, there is a sadness in it, to see the human heart so easily led astray. They stepped outside, where the autumn air was crisp and the sun cast a golden glow over the lawns. The motor car awaited, ready to carry them back to London. As they climbed in, Hastings glanced back at Blackthorn Manor, its ivy-clad walls standing silent witness to the drama within. "Poirot," he said, "do you think they'll recover? Violet, Margaret, the others?" Poirot's gaze was distant, his voice quiet. "In time, mon ami. The heart, it is resilient, even after such pain. They will heal, but they will not forget." The car pulled away, the gravel crunching beneath its wheels. Poirot settled back, his eyes closing briefly, a rare moment of repose. Hastings watched him, knowing that the little Belgian's mind was already turning to the next puzzle, the next mystery that would demand the brilliance of his little grey cells. For now, though, Blackthorn Manor faded into the distance, its secrets laid bare, its shadows dispelled by the relentless light of Poirot's reason. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The afternoon sun bathed Blackthorn Manor in a soft golden light, but its warmth did little to dispel the lingering chill of the previous night's revelations. The grand estate, with its ivy-clad walls and towering chimneys, seemed to stand in quiet mourning, as though acknowledging the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The guests, now free from the immediate shadow of suspicion, moved about with a... Hastings, however, felt a restless energy, his mind still grappling with the intricacies of the case and the human cost it had exacted. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft but precise. "You are pensive. The case is solved, the murderer apprehended, yet you carry the weight of it still, non?" Hastings sighed, adjusting his hat. "I suppose I do, Poirot. It's not just Warwick's guilt, it's the way it's torn everyone apart. Violet's heartbroken, Margaret's lost her husband, and the Blackthorns, well, their family secrets are out in the open. It's a grim sort of justice, isn't it?" Poirot's eyes softened, a rare glimpse of empathy beneath his usual precision. "Justice, Hastings, is often a bitter medicine. It heals, but it leaves scars. The truth, it is necessary, but it does not always bring peace." They stepped into the drawing room one final time, where the remaining guests had gathered to bid them farewell. Lady Eleanor Blackthorn stood by the fireplace, her posture regal, but her face etched with fatigue. Margaret Lisle sat nearby, her grief tempered by a quiet resolve, as though determined to move forward. Violet Harrow, her auburn curls loose and her eyes red-rimmed, sat alone, staring out the window. Sir Reginald and Clara Blackthorn stood apart, their marriage strained by the revelations of debts and scandals, yet bound by a shared history. Lady Eleanor approached Poirot, her voice steady but tinged with gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot thank you enough. You have brought clarity to a darkness that threatened to consume us all. I only wish it had not come at such a cost." Poirot inclined his head, his tone courteous. "Madame, it is my duty to seek the truth, however painful. The secrets of Blackthorn Manor, they could not remain hidden forever. But you, I think, will rebuild what has been broken." Margaret Lisle rose, her hands clasped tightly. "Monsieur Poirot, I don't know how to go on, knowing what Desmond did, what he caused. But your work has given me some closure. I can at least mourn him honestly now." Poirot's gaze was gentle. "Madame, grief is a heavy burden, but truth lightens it. You will find your strength." Violet turned from the window, her voice trembling. "You were right about Julian from it anymore." Poirot nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. "The truth, it is a mirror, Madame, Monsieur. It shows us who we are,
and it gives us the chance to change. As the guests exchanged farewells, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his voice low. "Mon ami, this case, it has been a study in human weakness, greed, fear, betrayal. Dr. Warwick killed to protect his secret, but he could not escape the truth. The clues, the note, the pearl, the cufflink, the letter, they were but shadows of a deeper motive." Hastings frowned, his curiosity stirring. "There's one thing I still don't understand, Poirot. The thud Grayson heard at 5:05. It wasn't the murder, you said. But what was it?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "A clever question, Hastings. The thud was Warwick's attempt to burn the remaining letters in the fireplace. He dropped a heavy book or box in his haste, creating the sound Grayson heard. The coroner's timeline confirmed the murder was earlier, between 4 and 5, and the thud was a secondary act, meant to cover his tracks." Hastings shook his head, marveling. "You saw it all, didn't you? Every detail, every lie." Poirot's smile was faint but confident. "The little grey cells, mon ami, they see what others overlook. The pattern, it emerges when one looks with clarity and method." They stepped outside, where the motor car awaited, its engine humming softly. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Blackthorn Manor loomed behind them, its grandeur restored but its secrets laid bare. Grayson, the butler, held the door open, his expression one of quiet respect. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "you've done this house a service. It won't be forgotten." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, Grayson. A house, like a heart, heals when the truth is known." As the car pulled away, Hastings glanced back at the manor, its windows glinting in the sunlight. "Do you think they'll be all right, Poirot, after all this?" Poirot's gaze was distant, his voice thoughtful. "They will endure, Hastings. The human spirit, it bends but does not break. They have faced their shadows, and now they must walk in the light."